Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the negotiation process that currently takes place between the United States of America, the European Union, London, more precisely France, and Ukraine itself. You know that these, let's say, countries, these organizations, these, let's say, regions of the world are trying to find most likely compromise, how to settle the conflict with the Russian Federation, how to settle a conflict in Ukraine. The United States of America see that the fastest way to stop this war is to recognize 5 regions of, let's say, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Crimea, LPR, DPR as a part of the Russian Federation, and they see that this will lead probably to the end of this conflict, or at least to the end of the hot phase of the conflict. But Zelensky several days stated that this is the red line for Ukraine. They will never accept this. Furthermore, the Russians are saying that they want to see not just these 5 regions as a part of the Russian Federation, they also want to see Ukraine as a demilitarized state without this army, like where now we can see 800,000 people serve in Ukraine army, and this is obviously the biggest army in the world. So the Russia will never accept this, and they will force the European Union, mainly London, to accept that Ukraine should reduce its army until 80,000 soldiers or something like this. And furthermore, the Russians, for example, want Zelensky to leave his position. They want to see someone else, and most likely someone pro-Russian. So a lot of questions, a lot of compromises should be done, but probably the most important statement was made by the United States of America and Marco Rubio during the previous several days, that if the world, if European Union and Ukraine are not going to accept the settlement of the conflict, then most likely the United States of America will quit this process, because the states have a lots of problems in different regions, in the Middle East with Iran, in Syria where the states began withdrawing their troops, and of course with China in its trade war. So lots of questions, and basically they believe that they should be focused in these things, on these questions, on these matters, but not in this European problem. So this is the situation, but when talking about the current status, we know for sure that, for example, today Germany announced additional military package. Germany announced a new package of military aid to Ukraine, which includes lots of equipment, drones, and many other things. And we see that, for example, Germany is not going to, let's say, stop this war machine. We see that they continue sending more and more weapons, and currently with Germany, probably the biggest country who provide the biggest, let's say, number of military aid and so on. Furthermore, we have very interesting statements from different pro-US journalists. Ukraine to suffer major losses in summer. American journalist David Ignatius, Trump, Rubio, and their teams seem to preparing to step away from this issue, leaving in the hands of the Europeans. And I'm sorry to say this, but despite the enormous efforts of the Europeans, they do not have the resources to replace the United States. They are not in a position to compensate for this gap, which means that unless something changes, Ukraine will find itself in a situation this summer where its losses will become increasingly severe. So this is probably the situation, because we see that the Russians continue their offensive operation, and we see that the Russians, telling the truth, improving their positions every single day. And first, let's talk, for example, about the Sumy direction, where the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions in the village of Gornal. At least this information was provided us by different neutral mappers. The Russians entered the village already from the northeast, and the clashes are taking place for first buildings and first constructions. The church is already far behind the Russians' back. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kupiansk direction, where the Russians also managed to improve their positions along the river Voskol. Today, different mappers in different sources, including neutral ones and pro-Russian resources, reported that the Russians during the previous night managed to improve their positions and to take several strongholds in the forest between the settlement of Kamenka and Krasnaya Persha. So this huge pocket is already under complete Russian control. We still haven't received anything that can confirm the presence of the Russian units in this area, but we see that the Russians continue advancing, and most likely and sooner or later the village of Kamenka would be taken by the Russians completely, and the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back. As for the Kupiansk direction itself, there are very heavy clashes for the settlement of Mala Shapkovka. Today, different neutral mappers confirmed Russian progress in this area, and I'll remind you that yesterday pro-Ukrainian sources published this video where we can see Ukraine counterattack, and the Ukraine counterattack, by the way, was carried out by the first corps Corps, by the 1st Corps of National Guard of Ukraine. So this is new formation that was created recently. And now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the south Liman direction. During the previous night, the Russians managed to improve their positions once again and significantly. First of all, this information was confirmed by pro-Ukrainian sources. As you can see, according to Deep State, the village of Nova is about to be taken by the Russians. But you can see that the pro-Ukrainian sources also expanded the gray zone or contested area. Now we see that there were huge territories around the positions of the armored force of the Russian Federation, even according to the pro-Ukrainian sources. When talking about other mappers, yes, the Russians improved their positions, the pro-Russian resources confirm this, and of course the neutral resources confirm the same situation. Let's discuss in details. According to different sources, the Russians managed to enter the village by the name of Ridkodub, and this is obviously the beginning of complete collapse for the Ukrainian defense in this direction, because this is already fourth village in this small pocket that was or about to be taken by the Russians. We're talking about the settlements of Nova Katerinovka, Nova Mikhailovka. Now the Russians entered the village of Ridkodub. Furthermore, according to the village of Nova Mikhailovka, the Russians control already more than 70% of the settlement, and the Russians control the most important part with forest. The Ukrainians control just fields, probably some buildings on the open air that can be destroyed by artillery or FPV drones without any problems. So we see that the Ukrainians' defense in this direction continue collapsing, and it's very difficult to understand how the Ukrainians are planning to stabilize the situation, and it is more even interesting to see and to understand what the Russians are planning to do next. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kliban-Bytska, let's say, reserve direction. Today we have a lot of icons, as you can see from this area, and we have a lot of flags, which means that the Russians during the previous night managed to improve their position significantly, mainly in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Sukha Balka, and dense network of the fortifications that were prepared and built by the Ukrainians around the settlement. So, for example, the map that you can see in front of your screens is the situation on the ground by the end of the 18th of April of 2025, and for example, this is the situation by the beginning of the 19th of April. So as you can see, the Russians managed to take under control and the complete control this dense network of the fortifications. At least 4 company strongholds were taken by the Russians. Furthermore, by the morning of the 18th of April, the Russians secured up to 80% of the village of Sukha Balka, and according to several pro-Russian resources, these 2 company strongholds were also taken by the Russians. So we haven't adjusted this map based on this report because so this is just report to understand the progress of the Russians. Furthermore, as we can see, the Ukrainians control just the northern part of Sukha Balka, but due to this situation and due to this configuration of the line of combat contact, we expect that either the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will report to the complete control over the settlement, or Ukrainians would fall back from this territory during the upcoming 24-48 hours. So the battle for these territories is about to be finished. Furthermore, the Russians intensified their attacks on the territory of Stara Nikolaevka. During the previous night, we got a lot of videos how the Russians were bombing and attacking with FPV drones the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine on the territory of this village, and this is obviously something like the beginning of preparation of this village before a major offensive operation. We expect that during the next 24-48 hours, the Russians will begin attacking this territory, and probably we're going to receive first videos, let's say, on the southern outskirts of the settlement, and then we'll start adjusting the map. So the battle for the village has started, and the Ukrainians most likely will be able to show some resistance, but just for several days, and then they will be forced to retreat further in the northern direction on the line between the settlements of Alexandropol, Zarya, and Romanovka. And this is the last defense belt where the Ukrainians will have chance to slow down the Russians. Otherwise, the Russians would be able almost to answer the southern part, the southwestern part of Konstantinovka. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the Chervona Kalina brigade. This is another brigade from the 1st military corps of the National Guard of Ukraine, 14th Operational Brigade Chervona Kalina, and this brigade is responsible for defense of the southeastern part of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. If you remember, several days ago, the Russians carried out very powerful offensive operation with the use of the significant number of armored vehicles, tanks, and infantry. Hundreds of vehicles, hundreds of soldiers were involved in that offensive operation that you can see right now in front of your screens. And Ukrainians reported, more precisely, Zelensky told us that the Ukrainians managed to repel this attack. The Russians suffered losses and were forced to fall back. But now we see that the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to enter the settlement of Mirolubovka. Today, pro-Ukrainian sources, once again from this Chervona-Kalina brigade, published this video where they were FPV droning and attacking the Russian vehicles and the Russian units also on the territory of this village. So, for example, this episode where we can see Russian vehicles that were moving freely on the southern part of the settlement of Mirolubovka, which means that the Russians have strong control over this territory, and the most important, the Russians have armored vehicles and tanks on the territory of this village. We believe we have adjusted the map, as you can see right now in front of your screens, but we believe that the Russians have bigger control over this territory. We believe that probably by the morning of the 19th of April, the Russians already established control over something like this. And this is another disaster for the armored forces of Ukraine, because we see that the southeastern flank of the Pokrovsk agglomeration collapses. We see that the Russians continue advancing, and that the Pokrovsk agglomeration could be caught in cauldron or could be caught in pincers in the very near future, because obviously from this direction the Russians will continue moving further in the direction of Novaya Ekonomichne. The Russians will attack the village of Malinovka Mirnaya, and the Russians already launched several attacks in the direction of this, let's say, N32 road, but these attacks, for example, were repelled by the Ukrainians. And this is the video how the Russian infantry was returning back after a failed storm. So they were returning back along the main road, and the Ukrainians were bombing the Russians with artillery. So lots of, let's say, videos, lots of episodes from this video as well. So we see that the Russians currently are trying to establish control over something like this. They want to take these territories under complete control, and this is going to be already something like semi-encircle of the city of Pokrovsk from the west and from the east. And the Russians will continue, most likely moving further in the direction of Rodinskaya. So we see that the Russians don't want to assault Pokrovsk in Mirnograd, trying to avoid, let's say, huge losses and destructions. They want to save the settlement, to save the city, with the purpose then to allow civilians to return back to the settlement and to restore, let's say, normal life on this territory of the city. Furthermore, the Russians continue advancing in the Bogatyr direction, and during the previous 24 hours, according to different sources, the, let's say, Russians managed to take under control fields to the south of the settlement of Bogatyr. I'll remind you that yesterday several pro-Russian resources reported that the Russians entered the village of Bogatyr itself from the southeast, but as you can see, we still haven't received anything that can confirm this. Furthermore, the Russians intensified their bombardments of Ukrainian positions to the north of Stepovo, Mali Sherbaki and Sherbaki. The Russians are not counting weapons and any calibers. They're bombing the Ukrainian positions, but we believe that due to the situation around the city of Orekhov, the Ukrainians realize that the Russians are planning to begin offensive. So that is why we believe that Ukrainians are concentrating their forces in this area with the purpose to counterattack and probably to restore control over the territories they lost during the Russian offensive. So we see that the first defense belt of Ukrainians is being destroyed by the Russians by artillery and aviation. We see the Dragon T's defense lines, so something huge might happen in this direction in the very near future. And that's it for the short video on military summary. Channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.